Hi, I'm April, and the name of my talk in the program is slightly different. It has something about weapons in it, and I don't actually like weapons, so I've changed it to Internal User Co-Design, a Powerful Relationship. So first, I will introduce myself a little bit. I am originally from Austin, Texas, where this iconic mural lives. But I live in London now and work. I head up the UX team at BenevolentAI. We are a biotech company that I'll tell you a little bit more in a second about. But I'll go ahead and just put it out there right now. This is not a talk about AI. It might come up from time to time because it is what we do, but it's not the focus of why I'm here. Yeah, so I'll just tell you a little bit about how I got to where I am. Many moons ago, I started out a career in marketing, did that for a little while, had, clients and stakeholders in consulting and healthcare. And at some point, I decided that I was actually more interested in design. So I took some classes, I started doing some freelance work, and eventually got hired at a company, software company in Austin called Convio that produces technology for nonprofit organizations, so like fundraising and donor data management for charities, that sort of thing. And that's where I was introduced to the role of UX and product design, which I eventually moved into. Convio was later bought by a company named Blackbaud that has a big presence here, so you may have heard of them. And then I was there for a while and eventually moved over to another software company called Athena Health, which provides software for doctors' offices and their staff and patients, that sort of thing. And I was there for quite a while and worked on all kinds of different complex products in healthcare, which I became really passionate about. Got involved in some leadership at that organization. And then 5 years ago, decided I wanted to move to another country. So my husband and I came to London. I started working as a product designer at Benevolent, where I am today. So what is Benevolent? This is our pitch. We unite AI and cutting-edge science to discover and develop new medicines for complex diseases. So basically, we're in a field called drug discovery. And what that means is essentially the identification of targets called genes that you target with molecules to come up with new medicines to become treatments. That's about as far into drug discovery as I'm going to go, because it's way more complex than that. And if I were to try to teach drug discovery today, not only would I probably do a pretty poor job, but we'd be here all day. So all you need to know is, if you look on the right side of the screen, you'll see that a big portion of our employee base is actually what we call drug discovery. These are the scientists that are performing the work, right? And we in product and tech, which is where UX lives, support that work with tools that they need to do their job. These are AI-driven tools. That's where the AI part comes in. We use machine learning models to make predictions that accelerate their work, but they are the stars of our company. We call them drug discovery scientists or drug discoverers. That's kind of internal lingo. I'll probably refer to them mostly as scientists today. And then real quick, I'd like you to meet the UX team. They're actually all here today, so if you have any questions about anything I talk about and you want to corner them after this, feel free to find them. We're 5 members strong, and we're made up of generalist product designers, so they do everything from discovery to validation and in between. They do user testing, the whole gamut. But we do also have a dedicated user researcher, and she not only leads best practices and conducts user research, but she manages our research operations, including things like privacy consenting and data governance and all of that. So, who we work with. In a little more detail. So as many of you are probably used to, we partner very closely with our product management partners and software engineers. We also interact pretty frequently with business development and marketing and communications to do things like align the product to the brand, or collaborate on the overall customer experience that we're delivering. And because we're an AI company, we also work with AI data scientists and machine learning engineers, and they are providing the data that goes into the products that we build. So they're also partners. But there's a whole other segment of critical collaborators, and these are the scientists that I mentioned a minute ago. They're everything from biologists to chemists to what we call bioinformatics data scientists, and the titles get more complex, and these are just a few of them. But they are our users. They're our colleagues, and they also are the people who are using the tools that we are designing and developing and performing the work of drug discovery. So now on to co-design, which is what I'm here to talk about. According to Australian consultancy Beyond Sticky Notes, co-design is designing with, not for. It's about making things and learning together, and I really like that definition. Also, I highly recommend this blog. It's a great resource for all things like what co-design is and isn't in a very broad sense, with great examples. And I'm going to talk today about using internal users to do co-design activities. But just a quick note before I go on, I do want to mention, I'm aware that, because this was the case for me until this company, many people don't actually have users who are internal to their company. But I do think these lessons can still be practiced and applied. And I would recommend finding the proxies where you can. So sometimes that's the customer support team at your company. They obviously have a lot of close contact with users and can really get in their mindset. A little further away from that, you could find colleagues who in some way resemble the personas that your users fit, and so you could do activities with them or incorporate them in the design process. As a little bit of a last resort, sometimes you could just get other team members who are willing to role play and put themselves in the mindset just for the sake of an exercise as your personas. If you have the budget and resources, you could also solicit an expert user panel. Sometimes this works well for consumer audiences, where you can get people from outside the company to volunteer to act as users for the purpose of collaborating. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of these activities look like in practice with some of the projects that I've been involved in. So this was one where, in order to help biologists who are using our products better understand gene disease links, there was some new data that our data scientists provided, and we needed to surface it in the tool that they use. So we got together our team of a product manager, a designer, 2 of those data scientists who had provided the data, and 2 of our biologist users. And we held group sketching sessions. So we actually, we looked at the raw data, and then everybody, did kind of a traditional activity where we would, either do crazy eights or just other types of individual sketching, and then we'd show and talk about what we'd done. But doing that together with the actual users really helped me as the designer, better understand their mental model and how they were envisioning this data. And then along the way, we also discovered that the data itself, this data type, we'll say, was new to many of the biologist users. It was a type of genetic data they weren't used to working with. And so it gave me the idea to develop an explainer graphic to also put in the UI as a little helper. And again, we as a group kind of honed and perfected what that graphic looked like. So when we went to do user testing, it was very well received kind of right away. In this other project, we were trying to improve the workflows for the chemists in their side of the house. And so I wanted to do a journey map. And instead of, the traditional route would be to go and do a bunch of user research and then for the team internally to work on a journey map together based on what you learn, which is a great way to approach it. But because we had the luxury of the users being in-house, I just brought them in and I said, tell me what your journey is. Tell me what your pain points and opportunities and needs are. And it really got me up to speed quickly on what their current workflow is, and I was able to develop an understanding and develop, both a current state and proposed workflow map that allowed me to then spend my user research time on more in-depth questions about the individual pain points and opportunities that arose. And then this completely different type of project, we wanted to, our engineer group needed a new API. And so we had a group of developers who built the API, and we had a group of software engineers who were the consumers of that API, all in-house. And the API developers were really nervous that the software engineers were going to be picky and not like what they did. And there were a bunch of different stakeholders whose needs they were trying to meet by building this thing. And so I kind of decided to teach them about how we approach things in design, empathy and listening and meeting your users where they are. And so we kind of got together as a co-design team and kicked off with a hopes and fears workshop where everybody kind of aligned on what we're looking to get out of this solution. Then the API developers produced some empathy maps with me. I did an empathy mapping activity with them. And at the end, when they had an MVP, when they got to the point in the process where they had an MVP ready to test, we got together and watched the users use the API, and I developed a heuristic template for a heuristic review that we performed, the API developers and I, while the users were using the tool. And then we got together and talked about it afterwards, and it really helped to prioritize the roadmap from there. So those are a few examples of the types of activities that we might do with users that fall under the label of co-design. But the important lesson that I want to pass on today is that co-design is or can be about so much more than one-off activities. For us, it's an ongoing relationship. It's a way of working. And it took us a few years to get to the point where we fully appreciated this. Don't get me wrong, having our users in the office with us as colleagues was already great. We knew that was a luxury that we had them right there. We could go to their desk for some quick feedback anytime, or we could schedule them for user research and occasionally hold these one-off activities. But including them in the design process overall just wasn't part of the culture for a long time. And so we mostly thought of them as user research participants, right? And we were really grateful that they were in-house and easy to access, but that's as far as we took it at first. So let me illustrate a little bit what it looked like at that time. So we had a traditional product team in most cases where a designer or a UX person, a product manager, an engineer would sit at a table and make up the squad, the usual players, right? And elsewhere in the company sat this lovely pool of users. And we would dream up a solution together based on some amount of discovery. And then we'd go conduct user testing. And we would hear things like, oh, that use case isn't really applicable or important to us. Or they would just give us feedback on a bunch of low-hanging fruit that, we needed to know about, but kind of took up a lot of time to address. And so we'd get, a high volume of feedback, and it could be poor quality, and eventually this would lead to potentially major rework, and the cycle would continue over and over until we got to a place that everybody was happy. It's expensive. But increasingly, designers would start conducting these one-off activities that like what I mentioned earlier, and we would include them in the process, and some success stories started to surface. So, people started hearing that so-and-so biologist was part of designing the solution, and they would be credited on a presentation, and people would notice that. the more this started happening, some users would start to ask to be involved in the process, and we would say, well, sure, yeah, come to this meeting or come to that demo and let's talk about it. We'd love to get your real-time feedback while we're designing. And at some point, the more this was happening, the product team and UX team looked at each other and we were like, we've got a really good thing going here. Like, we should formalize it. Like, we should make this something that people expect, that doesn't feel like a favor that we're asking. And so now it looks more like this. Designated users will sit within the product teams for a portion of their time, and that varies, but some portion of their time they spend coming to meetings and design sessions and feeling like part of the squad. For example, these days we call them science leads, and they have a title and a role in the product team. And they'll join and, like, say, attend daily stand-up or and a demo or whatever, and then activities throughout the process. And they'll give us their real-time feedback while designing, or actually generate ideas with us. They'll participate in roadmap and feature prioritization, and they'll observe user research sessions, which we do still conduct, which is really invaluable. And I will stop and actually say it's really important to still conduct user research and not let the co-design be a substitute for that, because there's always going to be bias in the people who help develop the solutions. So you don't want to use it as just a shortcut. It's more of an accelerator or something that makes the overall project more successful. So think of co-design as better preparation for your user testing. But yeah, so now we come up with a solution together as a group. We then go conduct the user research, and because we had the users involved from the beginning, we have a better idea of what's important to all of the user base. We get better, high-quality feedback. It's a better use of our time when we do the research, and that leads to only minor refinements. The overall cycle of iteration tends to be shorter. So this year, the world kind of changed a bit, and it's been touched on a lot today. So yes, admittedly, there is an expanding global appetite for generative AI tools in every industry, and we, like everybody else, realized that we could combine our expertise in the biology-specific AI models and methods that we were already developing. We could apply that to developing new externally facing products and tools that help scientists, throughout the pharma industry do better work. And so, disclaimer is that these products are still under wraps, they're still in the works, and I'm not allowed to show anything that we're working on just yet, which is why you're looking at a picture of ChatGPT, which, disclaimer, we have nothing to do with. But what I'm here to talk about anyway is the process. And the short of it is that our process itself hasn't really changed. We still, in fact, it's become more important and more critical, because now we realize we're in this unique position where we have these external users that we don't have a history with because we don't have existing customers, because we've always been kind of an internal house. But we have this user base who very closely resembles these external customers and can give us so much, rich information and perspective while we're designing and developing along the way. And so, they contribute, and we continue to conduct our research, like I mentioned, both on internal and now external users. So this is where it gets interesting. Prior to this point in my career, I'd only had external users or internal users, and now we've got both. And so as part of, as we shift our focus, like, we're having to ask ourselves several questions, like, how do we continue to leverage that expertise while designing for external users? We've got some split focus. How do we solve for both use cases? Because we are still a drug discovery company who is developing new medicines ourselves. And how do we understand the unique differences between the two sets of users? Because there will be differences. And we don't have all of the answers, but like I said, having these co-designers in part of the process, or as a huge important part of the process, is very helpful. So from that, I'm going to move on to what we call, or what we consider, our strategies for success. Like, these are the things that we've learned over the past couple years about how to implement an internal co-design program. And we didn't get it right from day one, as I said, but over time, we've learned that these are the promises that we make to each other on either side of the equation to make it work best. What we ask of our user co-designers is that they are there first and foremost to help us solve problems, right? So they are going to help us define the solutions, develop hypotheses, and ideate on solutions. That involves something like sketching, which can be new to scientists, but actually turns out they think it's kind of fun and they've been enjoying that. Decision making, so we want them to actually participate in the discussions about go, no go, and we want them to help us figure out what the metrics should be. They don't have to make the decisions, but we want them involved in the discussion. They're obviously a wonderful bridge to fellow users, and so they're good at identifying other peers to go solicit feedback from. We also like to have them co-present solutions in demos and presentations throughout the company because that really makes them, they're great advocates because they're championing the tools that they're actually going to be using. And then we ask for engagement, so we hope they're actively participating in Slack channels or whatever meetings are appropriate for them to come to keep up to date, and that they'll, like I said, observe user research sessions. And then on our side, what we commit to them is, well, first of all, that we include them. So we need to make sure that we introduce them as collaborative partners and make sure they have that seat at the table and they're invited to the appropriate touch points. We don't pick and choose when we include them in conversations. It is important to set clear expectations. Obviously, as excited as we are to have them participating, we know it's not their day job. They are there to do the science. And so we negotiate what the right amount of involvement is based on our needs and their needs, from the very beginning, set those expectations, get buy-in from their leadership, and make sure that there are no surprises along the way. And then visibility. We want to make sure they're celebrated for the work that they do and that we show our appreciation and we make sure their leadership is aware of all of the contributions that they're making. That keeps them coming back. So yeah, I've touched on some of these already, but here is what I consider a full list, or a pretty full list, of the benefits of working on solutions together with internal users, and a few of the minor risks or pitfalls to be aware of, and how we mitigate those risks. So, as mentioned, they're a wonderful proxy for your customer users, and they represent, similar backgrounds, hopefully, or are able to at least be stand-ins who who can role play as close to those backgrounds and give you that perspective as the other users that you're designing for that you don't have this close access to. They tend to be highly engaged because they've got the personal stake in improving the product, right? Whether they're your actual internal users, like in our case, where it's going to really benefit their day-to-day work, or just other colleagues within your company, everybody succeeds when the company succeeds and when the product succeeds, right? So people get excited to get involved. They live in your NDA safe space. This is really important in pharma in particular. There's so much IP that we can't disclose, which is why I haven't shown you much in terms of our product or our very specific workflows. Privacy is a big issue, and when we do user research on external customers, they're concerned about privacy for their company as well. And so we work a lot with dummy data. We hear a lot of genericized use case descriptions or scenarios, but when you're working with your internal users, you're all in the same NDA, and they can get really specific about real life situations, and it really helps to understand who you're designing for and what they might face. This one's kind of obvious, but can't go without saying, they're in-house, they're the people that you can reach easily, you can get on their calendars, you can follow up as needed. Make sure you don't abuse that, though. And then they're great translators. So part of them being, in the same world as your other users is that they speak their language better than you do, potentially. And so especially when they're saying all of this scientific stuff, like we in the UX team, that's not our background, and we've learned a lot on the job, but hearing very technical things said from a user that might be more meaningful than we realize, it can really help to have a user co-designer there who's saying like, no, this is what they're talking about, this is what they mean, and that actually is pretty important, or that actually is pretty common. And then they'll champion the work. So, like I said about engagement, like they co-own the solution, now they're invested in its success, and they make great advocates. Now, on the other side of things, there's just a few risks that we have to keep in mind while we're doing this. There's a tendency towards internal bias, right? And so you're all so used to solving your company's problems together and working in your product space the way you've built it to date that it can be an echo chamber sometimes, or we can forget that not everyone operates the same way. So we have to be careful not to assume that everyone does things the same way we do. And then similarly, they want things to succeed. Along with the engagement and optimism comes a tendency to be like too nice about how good a solution is. And so you got to kind of approach it with the same rational mindset that you do any user input. And also, we're talking about inviting more people to the table. So there's going to be more input overall to negotiate, which could slow things down or make it harder to make decisions. And these are some of the things that we do about that. As I've said already, co-design is not a substitute for user research, so you want to continue to test and validate with other users. Even when we're designing stuff for in-house purposes, we still go and user test with people who weren't involved in designing the solution. And now we also are user testing externally. Identify your assumptions as a team, so you can get away from some of this bias or overly optimistic perspective by making yourselves really sit down and reflect and identify what assumptions you've operated on, and then go through an exercise like assumptions mapping to prioritize the most risky or uncertain assumptions, and then go and resolve those with your research. And then finally, trust yourself. Remember, I think someone said it earlier, but UX, you have the craft and the methods and the expertise from your experience, and you are still the design expert in the room. Here are a few quotes from people inside our company. Our CTO is a big fan of where we've gotten to in terms of this program. He calls out impact, but also having embedded evangelists in the product team encourages better adoption, which is a goal of the product and tech organization. And then we have two scientists who talk about how powerful the role of co-designer feels to them, and how it saves them from bad surprises later on, or a lot of pain later on. Two independent quotes that kind of touched on the same feeling. So hopefully this has encouraged you to consider doing something like this in your organization if it's applicable. Here are some tips for getting started. I recommend figuring out who your potential users or stand-ins could be, and then easing them in the way we did. I think had we gone immediately to leadership and said, we need 20% of our users' time to help us design the tools they use, they would have looked at us like we were crazy. But we kind of exposed them to different activities, exposed them to different parts of the process, and then increased that over time. And just like a frog in boiling water, before we knew it, they were like, we love being co-designers. That said, you do want to, at some point, when it's becoming real, when you're taking it to that next level, make sure you do get the buy-in from leadership, make the case about the benefits to the product that we talked about a second ago, and then set the clear expectations. Having a written contract of commitments is very valuable because you can point to it and say, like, if I ever, don't live up to my side of the contract, then hold me to account. And then remember to champion them. These are people, not tools. So as human beings like to be rewarded and acknowledged for the good work that they do. And if you're inviting them to the table, that means you're giving them voice and you're giving them credit for their contributions. So I'll just repeat a few of those things that I just talked about here as a summary for key takeaways. Internal users or experts make really convenient and highly engaged proxies for customer users and really great internal champions. Beware internal bias and optimism. Co-design is not a substitution for user testing. Set clear expectations via a contract of commitment and get buy-in from leadership. And remember that co-designers are people, not tools, and so you want to include them as partners and acknowledge their contributions. And that is all from me. I want to thank my team who's here and also our marketing designer who joined us today, who helped me clean up this deck, and to you all for coming and listening.